All right, well, let's get back to the plains. In the early summer of 1864, in Colorado Territory, in the Denver area, there had been several ranches that had had livestock stolen, horses and cattle, by Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors. It was it was a difficult time. The war was going on, the Civil War. The crops that the Indians were being, quote, introduced to weren't doing so well. And remember, there were quite a few Cheyenne and Arapaho who had not gone on to the reservation there at Sand Creek. The chiefs who had signed off on that were really in the minority. Anyhow, a lot of livestock was being taken, and in some cases, the Indians were seen by the settlers, and in some cases they gave chase, but there was no violence attached to it at that point. It seems as though this was not a concerted war effort, but an effort to get food on the part of the Indians. However, there was one ranch where things turned out very differently, and that was a ranch just southeast of Denver, owned by a guy named Isaac Van Wormer. Okay, now by the way, the photograph is not of anyone that we're talking about here. It's just to show you kind of a typical frontier family and a typical frontier home. All right, so Isaac Van Wormer owned this ranch, and he had several hands that worked there, including one that he had hired to be essentially the manager of the ranch. It's a small ranch. And that guy's name was Nathan Hungate. So Nathan Hungate and his family lived there in a cabin on the Van Wormer property. He also had a hired hand that worked for Nathan, or under the supervision of Nathan, by the name of Miller. So the Hungate family were Nathan and his wife Ellen. They were both in their 20s. Nathan was 29 and Ellen was 25, and they had come to Colorado from Illinois. And they had two children. They had two little girls. One was 2.5 years old, just shy of, actually maybe a little more than 2.5, just shy of 3. The other one was an infant girl, about 6 months old. So Laura was the 2-year-old, and Florence was the 6-month-old. Well, we know what ultimately happened. The cabin was burned down, and the family was killed. Couple of different versions of how that played out. One, the one that was reported at the time and has been most widely accepted, is that Nathan Hungate and the ranch hand Miller were out looking for missing livestock, which indicates that perhaps the people who had been stealing livestock from surrounding ranches had hit them. So they're out looking for livestock, but then they see heavy smoke coming from the direction of the Hungate home. So Nathan immediately wanted to rush back there and make sure his family was okay. Miller said, essentially, to heck with that. They're dead if there's smoke, so I'm heading to Denver. So Miller leaves the story. In this version, Nathan comes back and sees his family has been massacred, and then he himself is captured and is killed. So that's the commonly accepted version. However, in recent years, Colorado historian Jeff Broom, who has done a lot of research into the archives, has come up with an alternate explanation. So we'll look at that alternate explanation in a second. So first of all, the basic facts. The family was was killed. The wife and the 2 children were killed. And then the husband was shot 80 times when he returned. All right, well, the alternate theory that Broom has is that Nathan Hungate, the husband, was at home at the time of the attack, because Broom asks the question, why? And by the way, the Indians who did this were never identified. There were conflicting opinions about the evidence left behind as to what kind of Indians it might have been. But Broom questions why, with so many incidents of livestock being stolen, probably for food, and no efforts to attack anybody, and not even efforts to attack some of the ranchers who kind of caught them at it and gave chase to them, why then would this whole family be killed? Broom speculates that because there were several weapons found inside the burned down cabin, weapons that were damaged by the fire, that indicates that the cabin was burned down first and then the people were killed, rather than the people being killed and then the cabin being burned down afterwards, because the Indians would have gone into the cabin and taken stuff, including these weapons. So the speculation Broom has is that Hungate had caught them in the act of taking some of his livestock and had fired on them, and perhaps hit one or maybe even killed one or more of them, which would then explain the attack on the cabin, the revenge motivated attack that would then be, and also explains kind of the anger that was indicated by Hungate's death. Shot 80 times. Ammunition's expensive. So Broom speculates that there had to have been some reason for that. However, regardless, the facts are the family was killed, and there had been Cheyenne and Arapaho seen in the area taking livestock. So when news of this reached Denver, people just kind of got a little hysterical, understandably, and there was a whole lot of anger. In fact, the governor of the territory was quoted as saying that essentially we just need to find all Cheyennes and kill them wherever they are, regardless. So that was sort of the mood there in the Colorado Territory in the summer of 1864. The Cheyenne Dog Soldiers and their Arapaho allies were in fact making raids, mostly in Kansas and Nebraska, and all this became part of what is known as the Colorado War, which was not confined to Colorado. Meanwhile, in Colorado Territory, the local cavalry militia, commanded by Colonel John Chivington, was having little dust-ups and skirmishes with some of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, and the aforementioned governor of Colorado Territory, John Evans, was really, I said that he had called for basically the killing of all Cheyennes. He was really stoking the fires of the public mood, as was Chivington. In fact, the bodies of the Hungates were displayed in Denver for people to come see, and to further stoke their anger. In addition to the husband Nathan with his many gunshot wounds, the wife had been stabbed multiple times. All 3 females had their throats cut. The 2 children almost to the point of being decapitated, and the infant had been eviscerated. And all this was put out on display. The newspapers were crying for vengeance and the eradication of all Indians. Some people have hinted that perhaps Chivington had some political aspirations, and the fact that, from the point of view of the Cheyenne and Arapaho in Colorado Territory, many of them felt that they were being constantly harassed by the volunteer cavalry. There's some speculation that he was trying to, have some really big victories against Indians that he could translate into a political career. Chivington was a former Methodist pastor, and he had served, as had many of the people in the Colorado militia, previously in that Battle of Glorieta Pass that I mentioned down in New Mexico. That was so important. George Bent, if you'll remember, the son of the guy who had set up that trading post on the Santa Fe Trail back in the 1830s, he is, by this point, he has gone back to live with his mother's people, the Cheyenne, and so he was one of the warriors who was involved in some of these skirmishes. He speculated that Chivington was trying to basically manufacture a large Indian threat so that he wouldn't have to go fight more Confederates in Kansas. Although I think that the political aspirations might be more believable. Either way, there was continued intense anger among the settlers, among the people, the white people in Colorado Territory. In August, Governor Evans issued a call for volunteers for the 3rd Colorado Volunteer Regiment, 3rd Colorado Cavalry, that said, "Attention Indian fighters," promising equal pay to regular cavalry, a 100-day enlistment, so a little over 3 months, to go on a punitive expedition to punish the Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors who had committed these depredations. Now, I mentioned that both the governor and Chivington were stirring people up. Chivington, in a public speech, said, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I've come to kill Indians, and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice." End quote. For those of you who are not up on your lice terminology, a nit is a baby louse. So in other words, kill them when they're small, because they're just going to grow up and you'll have to kill them later, he says, and scalp them, and anything else that you have to do, or essentially, I guess, that you want to do. So among the soldiers who were in this 3rd Cavalry under the command of Chivington was a company commander, a captain, Captain Silas Soule. Remember him. He's going to play an important role in what unfolds. Now, that was in August. In September, Black Kettle and some of the other Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders met with the governor, suing for peace, essentially saying, we haven't done anything wrong. Everyone wasn't responsible for things that may have happened. And they were told by the governor that if they were peaceful, all peaceful Indians needed to not only confine themselves to that reservation area that the Treaty of Fort Wise had restricted them to, but he said that essentially, to prove that your peaceful intent, you should all gather together in one big village there along Sand Creek. And he was also told, Black Kettle was told, that just in case, because he was a little bit worried about still being attacked. And he was given an American flag and said that if anyone tries to attack you, just wave that American flag and they'll know that you're on our side, and essentially everything will be cool. So there were some captives, about 7 captives that had been taken in raids by the dog soldiers, and Black Kettle and the others negotiated to get those captives and exchange them, get them back to the territorial government in return for some captives on their side. And George Bent was one of the translators that facilitated that. So Black Kettle and Little Raven, remember him, he was one of the Arapaho leaders who had signed that Fort Wise Treaty. They led their people, the ones who didn't want to be involved in any kind of warfare or conflict, led them back to the reservation and set up camp as directed along Sand Creek. Chivington's 3rd Volunteer Colorado Cavalry spent most of the next 3 months, the fall of 1864, traveling around trying to find any of the bands of Cheyenne dog soldiers or hostile Arapaho allies, unsuccessfully. They didn't find anybody, which led to the local newspapers making fun of them. Actually, they started referring to them as the Bloodless Third. If it's true that Chivington was an ambitious person who hoped to parley success in an Indian war into possibly some political office in the future, his one big shot at it not panning out and instead leading to him being the object of ridicule was not what he was looking for. So toward the end of November, as the 100 days was about to expire, finally, Colonel Chivington came to the conclusion that if he couldn't catch the dog soldiers, but he needed to kill some Indians, he knew where there were some at. They were at Sand Creek because he was there when they were told that's where they were supposed to be if they were peaceful. So he took the 3rd and picked up some troops also from the 1st Colorado Volunteer Cavalry, and with around 700 men and several cannon, made his way to Sand Creek and surrounded the village with his cannon and ordered his men to charge. Now, 2 of his men, 2 company commanders, viewed this as an illegal order and refused to comply, and in fact had their companies, and the company's about 80 men, had their companies hold back and not move forward. And those were Captain Silas Soule, that we mentioned earlier, and Lieutenant Joseph Cranmer. No one else, no other company commanders did that, however, and all the others rushed forward, and the cannon began to fire. Now, as the soldiers were approaching, Black Kettle came out and stood in front of his teepee and began to wave the American flag as he had been told to do. And in fact, he had attached to the same flagpole a white flag of truce. So he's standing there waving that around furiously, hoping to convince these troops that were attacking that they were peaceful. But that was to no avail, because the troops who were attacking knew that they were peaceful. Now, there were no dog soldiers here. There were a couple of hundred, between 200 to 300 people in the village. All told, the complete number was about 75 men. And those 75 men for the most part, were those who were either too old to hunt or to go on a war raid, or too young. Just a handful of actual fighting age men in the village. And here is another view of the same thing, Black Kettle waving his flag as drawn by an actual Cheyenne eyewitness. This image is from a winter count on that Cheyenne artist's teepee. So this is how he commemorated and remembered the year 1864. I'm going to give some details of this attack, and these details are disturbing and they're graphic. And every time I talk about this subject, I always kind of grapple with this as to just how much detail that I should give, because of possible, the trauma that's involved. But I always come down on the side of at least giving some of the clinical details, because it's very important to understand exactly what we're talking about in this instance and what makes this different from other occasions. And there are many other occasions, some of which we're going to talk about, in which the United States cavalry charged into Native American villages and killed women and children. How is this different from any of those? Well, we really have to examine that. And you need to remember that this was not the United States Cavalry regular army. This was Colorado militia. So that means it's not soldiers who had been sent from somewhere else. These soldiers were 100-day volunteers from the area who were subject to all the prejudices and passions against the Cheyenne and Arapaho that people in the area would have had, particularly considering the fact that in the short time that there had been a large number of settlers in that area with the discovery of gold in Pikes Peak in 1859, so just 5 years, there had been a lot of tension between the locals and the Indians, and there had been several incidents, including that Hungate Massacre that we talked about, and all the newspapers inflaming everything. So bear that in mind. Okay, so what happened was the soldiers under Chivington's command came charging into the village, sabers flashing, guns blazing, and there weren't really a whole lot of fighting age Cheyenne or Arapaho men present. By the way, Little Raven was not there. He had camped his band farther away from this main village where the other Cheyenne and Arapaho were. So he didn't perish in this like a lot of other Cheyenne and Arapaho did. Well, over the course of this attack, remember there's about 700 or so soldiers. 15 of them were killed, and more than 50 of them were wounded. According to most accounts, the largest number of the wounded were a result of friendly fire, because the shooting was just indiscriminate. And also, a lot of these soldiers had been drinking heavily before the attack started. Some of them, though, no doubt were wounded or killed by the small amount of defense that the Indians were able to put up. So that's what happened on their side. 15 killed. On the other side, somewhere between 150 and 200 Indians were killed in this attack. 2/3 of them were women and children. 1/3 were adult males, but many of those were elderly, and some of those barely qualified as adult. So somewhere between 150 and 200 killed. Well, the killing was it was just absolutely unregulated. Not that regulating killing sounds like a strange thing, but this was mayhem, and mayhem and worse. So what happened was that while a lot of the participating soldiers really just went wholeheartedly into this slaughter, this massacre of innocents, many did not, including those two companies that didn't even go in. But even among those who were ordered in, some of them were deeply, deeply disturbed by the things that they saw and started talking about it afterward. Not that there needed to be a lot of talking, because word got out pretty quickly, as we will see. But some of those people were able to give eyewitness accounts from the side of the soldiers of the things that were going on. And here's one from a Major Anthony that was quoted in the New York Tribune. There was one little child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead, and this little child was behind, following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling in the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and draw up his rifle and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, "Let me try the son of a bitch, I can hit him." He got down off his horse, kneeled down, and fired at the little child, but he missed him. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped. So there they were, making sport out of killing a 3-year-old child. There were also reports of pregnant women being ripped open and the fetuses being ripped out of their womb. There were reports, here's one specific report. Also, this is quoted in a work by Stan Hoig, but this is one of the eyewitnesses at court later on, who said, "Fingers and ears were cut off the bodies for the jewelry they carried. The body of White Antelope, lying solitarily in the creek bed, was a prime target. Besides scalping him, the soldiers cut off his nose, ears, and testicles, the last for a tobacco pouch." And White Antelope was not the only male victim whose scrotum was made into a tobacco pouch. There were others, and there were reports of women's breasts being cut off and made into pouches, and of vaginas being cut open and women's organs being cut out and made into hat bands. And in fact, quite a large number of the soldiers took noses and ears and various other body parts, including genitalia from men and women, and attached them to their swords and rifles, decorating them. And in at least one case, an unborn child's body being used as a decoration. And they rode back into the city of Denver with these grisly items, showing them off right there in the middle of town, going from saloon to saloon. And for the most part, the people of Denver were just eating it up and celebrating roundly and voicing approval for this kind of behavior. A lot of this had happened after the initial onslaught, when a handful had managed to escape. Many had been killed, and then the soldiers went through the village, teepee by teepee, and killed the wounded, and proceeded to scalp every single one of the bodies, from infants all the way up to old men and women. I have to be honest. Every time that I give this lecture or talk about this subject, and I've done so at least a couple of dozen times over the years, it really gets to me. And even today, I've had to pause in my recording 2 or 3 times just to kind of gather myself, because this is not at all enjoyable to talk about or to think about. And that's true for me. It was also true for people who heard about it at the time, including this individual that we've talked about already just recently, Kit Carson. This is a picture of him from later in life than the earlier photograph. Kit Carson, of course, as we mentioned before, was a mountain man before he became a colonel in the Union Army. And at the time that this was going on, he was actually down in Texas fighting Comanches. In fact, the massacre at Sand Creek happened on November 29th, just about, I think, 4 days after the first battle of the Adobe Walls that Carson was involved with. Anyhow, after he had heard about what happened, he was talking later to another Union colonel, James Rustling, and this is what Kit Carson had to say about it. Just to think of that dog Chivington and his dirty hounds up there at Sand Creek. His men shot down squaws and blew the brains out of innocent little children. You call sich soldiers Christians, do you? And Indians, savages? What do you suppose our Heavenly Father, who made both them and us, thinks of these things? I tell you what, I don't like a hostile redskin any more than you do, and when they are hostile, I've fought them, hard as any man. But I never yet drew a bead on a squaw or papoose, and I despise the men who would. Well, as we saw, the people of Denver and many of the rest of the people in Colorado Territory did not agree with Kit Carson. They were just pleased as punch about what had happened for the most part. However, there were lots of people, some people in Colorado, but lots of people around the country who agreed more with Carson, and that included the high command of the United States Army and quite a few members of Congress, to the extent that Chivington was brought up on military charges. There were hearings held looking into what had happened. He was claiming that that he'd killed 600 or 700 Indians, and almost all of them had been warriors, which was the furthest thing from the truth. And because of these hearings, this is why we know so many details about what happened, because it was entered into the court record by some of the soldiers who were willing to testify. And chief among these was Captain Silas Soule, the one who had refused to order his men into the fray because he believed it to be an immoral and illegal order. And he testified against his commander, and it was very, very damning testimony. And oddly enough, a couple of weeks later, Captain Soule was mysteriously murdered. Now, I think that the events that happened were absolutely, this is me talking by the way, absolutely a horrible stain on American history and on the U.S. Army and military. But I think that Silas Soule should be recognized as a hero. Here's the conclusion that was reached by one of those hearings, the one that was held by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And that panel declared the following, quote, "As to Colonel Chivington, your committee can hardly find fitting terms to describe his conduct. wearing the uniform of the United States, which should be the emblem of justice and humanity, holding the important position of commander of a military district and therefore having the honor of the government to that extent in his keeping, he deliberately planned and executed a foul and dastardly massacre, which would have disgraced the veriest savage among those who were the victims of his cruelty. Having full knowledge of their friendly character, having himself been instrumental to some extent in placing them in their position of fancied security, he took advantage of their inapprehension and defenseless condition to gratify the worst passions that ever cursed the heart of man. Whatever influence this may have had upon Colonel Chivington, the truth is that he surprised and murdered in cold blood the unsuspecting men, women, and children on Sand Creek, who had every reason to believe they were under the protection of the United States authorities, and then returned to Denver and boasted of the brave deed he and the men under his command had performed. In conclusion, your committee are of the opinion that for the purpose of vindicating the cause of justice and upholding the honor of the nation, prompt and energetic measures should be at once taken to remove from office those who have thus disgraced the government by whom they are employed, and to punish as their crimes deserve those who have been guilty of these brutal and cowardly acts. So that doesn't really leave a whole lot to the imagination or to doubt as to how they felt about Colonel Chivington, that they felt he should be removed from office. Now, what Chivington actually did was resign. He resigned his commission in February of 1865, just 3 months after the massacre. And once he resigned, then military justice had no hold on him. What are they going to do? Fire him? And so any justice would have to be undertaken by the people of Colorado Territory, and as you can probably guess, that wasn't going to happen. So essentially, he got off. He got away pretty much scot-free for these heinous actions. However, he didn't have the political career he had been angling for. He was kind of persona non grata outside of Colorado. He had some, a couple of failed businesses at one point. He skipped off to Canada to avoid some of his debtors. Apparently seduced his daughter-in-law and ran off with her and married her until she left him for failure of support. So he didn't have an auspicious remainder to his life, at least. And in 1996, in view of the fact that Chivington had been a lay Methodist preacher, the United Methodist Church issued an official apology to the Southern Cheyenne people for the behavior of one of their own. Which might lead you to the question, gee, I wonder what the Indians thought about all this. Well, you can imagine what they thought about it. The dog soldiers who had refused to be confined to that reservation to begin with offered this up as evidence they were right, that they were right all along. Many others who had been a little more inclined, perhaps toward peaceful resolutions, no longer were after this. Quite a few Cheyenne and Arapaho people left Colorado Territory and joined the Lakotas in the Black Hills. Lakotas were having some issues of their own. As we'll talk about a little later, there had been gold discovered in the Powder River country, and there were more and more miners going through Lakota territory on the Bozeman Trail. So the Lakotas had started raiding them, and now they find out what happened at Sand Creek with their allies, their close allies, the Cheyenne and Arapaho, plus what had just happened a couple of years before to their kinsmen, the Dakotas in Minnesota, many of whom had come and joined them as well. Now, the United States, realizing that this was going to be a big problem, very embarrassed by what had happened at Sand Creek, tried to smooth things over. Although how are you going to smooth over something like what I just described? That's one of the reasons, aside from the moral outrage, that the high command of the regular army was so upset, because they're fighting a civil war that's taking, takes quite a bit of resources. And in the middle of it, you don't want to infuriate a whole lot of native tribes. And yet that's exactly what had happened. They offered to make a deal with the remaining Cheyenne and Arapaho, and even offered to give them extra annuities, but the war leaders of the Cheyenne and Arapaho refused to meet with them because they're pretty hot by this time. In fact, a couple of the Lakota bands, and remember there are 7 bands overall, 2 of those Lakota bands, the Brule and the Ogallala, actually entered into an alliance with the Northern Cheyenne and the Southern Cheyenne, and the Northern Arapaho and the Southern Arapaho, right after Sand Creek, to exact some vengeance on the white people, particularly in Colorado Territory. And here are a couple of the leaders that were involved in that. On the left, you see a guy named Spotted Tail. He was a chief of the Brule Lakota. On the right, you see a Cheyenne warrior named Roman Nose, which wasn't actually his Cheyenne name, because why would Cheyennes call someone Roman Nose? His name was Hook Nose, and that's just kind of how the Americans interpreted that. A Roman or aquiline nose, meaning like a big hooked nose. So kind of a weird name, but that's what the Americans called him. He was a very prominent warrior, but he had been inclined toward peace. He was not a dog soldier. He was a member of the Crooked Lance Society. But now that those days are gone, and so he and his band join up as well. Now, I have these folks here. I don't have a photograph of Roman Nose. There are no photographs of that individual, though there are several that claim to be of him. But there are no verifiable ones. But I put them there because both of these guys are going to show up again after this conflict. Roman Nose pretty soon, and Spotted Tail way down the road. All this was still officially part of the Colorado War. So the map that I have here shows a lot of the things in the early part of that war. The things there, Big Timber Creek and Ayers Column in May. That was 64. That was some minor skirmishes, and then you've got 3 other battles listed there that were also skirmishes in the efforts to try to pin down the dog soldiers after that Hungate Massacre. The Sand Creek village is represented by a teepee right there next to Pawnee Fork. So after Sand Creek, as mentioned, the Oglala and Brule had gotten together with the Northern and Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho, and they came back into Colorado Territory to wreak vengeance. Over 1,000 warriors with the 3 tribes combined, and they struck the town of Julesburg, which is up there near the North Platte River, right there by Camp Rankin, and pretty well destroyed the town. Most of the townspeople managed to make it nearby into the fort, which only had about 60 soldiers, but was a fort, and they were able to stay safe in there. I think about 14 or 15 people were killed altogether. Then after that, this was in January, so just a little over a month after Sand Creek. Throughout the rest of January, there were raids in small ranches all around the western part of Colorado Territory. A couple of the more destructive and famous ones are listed here: the attack on the American Ranch and on the Godfrey Ranch. Then in February, there were skirmishes with the military at in Mud Springs and Rush Creek, both in Nebraska Territory. So what happened was this large force came in to Colorado and Nebraska, spent about 6 weeks raiding and fighting, and then headed west toward Wyoming to join up with the larger Lakota force there where they lived, or where they were operating, at least at that time, in the Powder River country. Along the way, in July of 1865, they had another encounter with the U.S. Army at a place in Wyoming called Platte Bridge. In that one, there was a young Ogallala warrior named Tashunka Whitko, who proved himself exceptionally brave in that battle as he had in the previous battles. And as a result of his actions in that battle, he was designated a shirt wearer, which is a special war shirt, which means essentially he's now a war chief. So remember him, Tashunka Whitko, or as he's known in English, Crazy Horse. So at this point, Black Kettle, by the way, had not gone on any of those raids, he nor his band, nor did they head off to Wyoming. They did the opposite. They headed south down into Indian Territory, along with quite a few of the southern Arapaho. And not long after, Black Kettle's band, his Cheyenne band, and their Arapaho allies agreed, because again, they're not wanting to get revenge. They're not at war. They're wanting peace. So they agreed again to go to a reservation and locate themselves in a particular spot where the U.S. government told them to be and told them they would be safe. In fact, they told them that this new land in Indian Territory would be theirs as long as the grass grows and the river flows. And that was along the Washita River. So we will be revisiting them later. We will also be revisiting that force of Cheyenne and Arapaho who went west to Wyoming to join up with the Lakotas. Which, by the way, what was significant about the Colorado War, this last part of it, this series of raids in January and February 1865, that's the last time the Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho would be fighting alongside the Southern Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho and the Lakota. So they're going to be separated after this. They're kind of going off already to their own corners, as it were. And future wars are not going to be punitive wars on the part of the Indians like this one was, where they were going out to get revenge. They're going to be defensive from that point forward. And I've already talked about the fact that gold had been discovered in Montana, in the Powder River country, and that the Lakota there were starting to step up their attacks on people traveling along the Bozeman Trail. And that's where we're going to go next, although that's a different lecture and a different war, but it's coming right up.